I'm Sophie Howe. As you heard, I was the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my screen. If you are seeing my screen, you're seeing one of my future generations. This is my little girl, Belle. She's she's 9 now. I think she was about 7 there. This is a sort of image, I suppose, of how I feel I'd like all of our future generations to be growing up. So connected with nature, happy and thriving. And my job in Wales as the first Future Generations Commissioner was to act as the guardian of the interests of the future generations of Wales, and to hold the government, our Welsh Government and other public institutions to account on how they were acting in the interests of future generations. I suppose when you think about a Future Generations Commissioner, it's not something that immediately everyone perhaps understands, what it is. Perhaps you think that it might be someone who is trying to predict the future, and we know that generally when futurists predict the future, they don't often get it spot on. I'm going to start with some predictions from futurists back in 1923 as to what the world would look like in 2023. So curls for men, apparently, were the prediction, and we should worry because women will be shaving their heads. But I think we can take heart by the fact that there'll be no more hard work. We'll only be working a 4-hour day, owing to the work of electricity, and the fact that perhaps we'll be living as long as 200 years. And maybe that's something to do with utensils made from pulp. So all of these predictions from people and experts in 1923 about what the world would look like in 2023. And although some of these are quite amusing, there are some things, I suppose, nods to the future, or things that we can see that are relevant now in 2023. So we're ending our love affair with plastic. We've just seen the world's biggest trial of a reduced working week. We're reconstructing what we have previously thought about gender, and of course life expectancy has been on the increase, although starting to plateau. So not quite living to 200 years. But certainly we can see some things that are relevant from those predictions. But what are the other things really that is facing the world now that we are predicting, and some of the things that we know will happen? We don't know exactly how they will play out, but these are some of the big challenges facing the world in 2023. So the rise of AI, automation, artificial intelligence, what will that mean? And what is that already meaning in terms of the way that we're living and working? Obviously, the big existential threat in terms of climate change, but also, ecological damage and ecological threat, but also some of the demographic changes in population, and particularly the aging population. And the challenge that we have here is that across the world, our systems of governance really are just incredibly bad at planning for the future. We work on the basis of short-term political cycles, short-term election cycles, short-term budget cycles, short-term performance measures. And in any of these 3 areas and many more, we are nowhere near taking the steps that we need to be, or taking the action that we need to be taking now in order to prepare for the possible futures that these sort of mega trends, I suppose, are likely to bring. But in Wales, we are trying to change that. We have quite a long history with sustainable development. This is part of our sustainable development journey. When the Government of Wales was established through the Government of Wales Act 1998, there was a clause in our legislation which said sustainable development should be a central organising principle of what the government does. You can see here various sustainable development strategies. When Wales gained new lawmaking powers after another referendum in 2006. The Government of Wales Act 2006 said that ministers should put in place arrangements to promote sustainable development. And again, you can see more strategies. And perhaps, here's the problem with strategies, and here's a problem with laws which are, don't put much meat on the bone, if you like, just those sort of one clause. That actually the reality was, although sustainable development being a central organising principle is a lofty ambition and a worthy ambition for government, in reality it wasn't happening. In reality, what that meant is that the Environment Minister would take a report to the Senedd, that's the Welsh Parliament, once a year about stuff that was happening mainly in her department relating to sustainable development, and it wasn't really seen as the business of the Economy Minister or the Housing Minister or the Transport Minister. And this particular Environment Minister, Jane Davidson, was really frustrated about this. And she managed to convince the then First Minister of Wales that all of this was failing, really, and that we needed to put more meat on the bone of what we meant by sustainable development being a central organising principle. She convinced him to put in place a manifesto commitment for the next elections, which simply said, we will legislate for sustainable development. The Labour Party won that election and were therefore responsible for implementing this manifesto commitment. But she had actually retired from government at that point, at that election. So the new government were left with this thing that had been her baby, not really knowing exactly how they should take it forward. So they had an ingenious idea, which was, if we don't know exactly what this should be, we should actually ask the people of Wales. So before they had, a formed view of what is sustainable development. Obviously, we'd look to, what was happening internationally, but let's ask the people of Wales, what is the Wales we want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? So that national dialogue, the Wales We Want, was held in sort of 2013-14, where that question was posed. And what the people of Wales said led to the development of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So it morphed from a Sustainable Development Act to a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which does a number of things. So first of all, it puts in place this overarching duty on all of our public institutions. So that's our government, our health boards, our local authorities, some of our national agencies, all of our main public bodies in Wales. They must demonstrate that they're taking decisions in a way which meets today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It then, based on the conversation that we had with the citizens of Wales, sets out these 7 long-term wellbeing goals. And you can see the goals here in terms of their titles. Nothing particularly controversial, nothing really that you could disagree with. Who doesn't want a prosperous Wales, a more ecologically resilient Wales, and so on? But there are a few things which are significant here. First off, I want to ask you to look at the definition of a prosperous Wales, an innovative, productive and low carbon society, which recognises the limits of the global environment and therefore uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change. I'm not going to read the whole thing out. You can see it there. But what you might note is the omission of any reference to GDP. And what you will probably note is that our definition of prosperity is prosperity very much within planetary boundaries. The second really interesting thing about these goals is the duties on all public bodies to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of the wellbeing goals. And that essentially means that each of our public institutions needs to work beyond their traditional boundaries. They need to recognise the connections between these things. So, for example, the healthcare system, globally, if the healthcare system was a country, it would be the 5th biggest emitter of carbon in the world. We know that carbon and climate change and the effects of climate change is one of the biggest threats to human health. So we've got a situation where on the one hand, we've got a healthcare system trying to treat people when they're ill, and on the other hand, being responsible for one of the main factors that is going to make people ill. And we can see those connections across so many policy areas, but our systems of governance, of policy making, of service delivery often absolutely ignores those connections and operates purely within silos. The other important thing about the setting of these long-term goals is I always say you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a set of long-term goals, but it's completely revolutionary. There's no other country in the world that has long-term goals set out in law. And that is perhaps why, we're so bad at kind of looking to the future. Generally, we see commitments and, based on short-term electoral cycles, which is why we find ourselves not having dealt with the long-term challenges that span beyond electoral cycles and often beyond generations. So setting out that vision of what we're trying to achieve in Wales, what is the Wales we want to leave behind to future generations, forms the basis of everything that our government and our public bodies do. And I think this quote sums it up. You've got to think about the big things while you're doing the small things, so that all the small things go in the right direction. So we know in Wales the direction that we're trying to go in. The next area that the Act covers is it sets out a toolbox, if you like, of the ways in which our public bodies must work in order to deliver and reach those long-term wellbeing goals. So 5 ways of working. First of all, they must show that they've considered the long-term impact of the things that they do, and there are particular mechanisms in the Act. For example, the government producing a future trends report that public institutions must use to look at all of the key future trends, potential scenarios for Wales, local duties on something called public services boards which require them to look at the long-term, short, medium and long-term well-being issues in their area and then set local plans, well-being plans to deal with them. Secondly, prevention. So preventing problems from occurring or getting worse. We all know that prevention is better than cure, but generally public policy is really bad at doing that. Integration. So this is, as I said, recognizing the connections between different policy areas. So we should choose to do the things that make the biggest contribution to each of the 7 wellbeing goals. And we should consider that both in what we choose to do and how we choose to do it. So as an example of that, the government had a manifesto commitment to build 20,000 affordable homes. That's good. You can map the provision of affordable housing across a number of those wellbeing goals. But if we didn't think about building low carbon housing and joining up government departments so that our skills programs were routing people into the good quality jobs that were going to be made available by building those homes, and if we didn't think about the planning and design and construction of those homes in a way which builds in sites for nature, which builds in cohesive communities, which builds in good transport links, then actually the way in which we're building those 20,000 affordable homes is missing a whole load of opportunities to deliver further against those wellbeing goals. So that integration is really important, and integration requires collaboration. So a requirement on all our public bodies to work together and to work beyond the public sector with the private sector, the voluntary sector, and so on. And then involvement. So the importance of involving people with an interest in achieving the goals and ensuring that those people reflect the diversity of the area that the public body serves. So recognising that people are their own experts. The word is involvement there. It's not consultation or engagement. It's a much deeper sense of co-production. I want to just touch on another element around that kind of the importance of connection and integration. Whatever your starting point, there are connections across each of those 7 wellbeing goals. If we just take an example here in terms of health. So this is from the World Health Organization Health Equity Status, and they looked at the reasons for the differences in life expectancy. So what are the factors that are most important in terms of us living a long old life or dying before we should. And we know that there are big gaps, both in terms globally, from the global north to the global south, but even within our own communities here, massive gaps in life expectancy between particular communities. And here are the reasons for those gaps in life expectancy. Interestingly, only 10% of what makes a difference in terms of life expectancy is the healthcare system itself. And yet what we can see, both in terms of, public commitment to, government commitment to, the resourcing of, actually a huge amount of government resource goes into the healthcare system itself. And in the UK, it's between about 40 and 45% of the whole government budget goes into resourcing our National Health Service, which is much loved and much needed, but actually it only equates to 10% of the difference in life expectancy. The biggest chunk of what makes a difference is about income security and social protection. So, are you living in poverty? Can you put food on the table, and so on? 35% of what makes the difference. 29% of what makes the difference is about our living conditions. So what's the quality of your housing? Are you living in an area with high air pollution? Do you have access to nature? Is your community safe? And, so 29%. So we could actually say the role of those people who plan, design and build our communities, and an investment in providing good quality housing, is almost 3 times more important than any investment in our national healthcare infrastructure. And then 19% about social and human capital. So what's the quality of your relationships? Do you have people you can turn to in your hour of need? Is there a sense of community in the area that you live, and do you feel you have agency in that community? So again, often this sort of social and human capital, relationships, community and so on is seen as the soft and fluffy stuff that perhaps government shouldn't be involving themselves in, but far from it being soft and fluffy, it actually relates back to that hard metric of how long are you going to live. So absolutely, there is a role for government in getting involved in these things. So the Act then also establishes a Future Generations Commissioner. So I was described as the world's first minister for the unborn, which is quite a cool title, not strictly accurate because I wasn't a minister of the government. My role was to hold the government to account, and I describe it often as a role of both coach and referee. So powers to advise and support our public institutions on the steps that they should take to meet the wellbeing goals. How do they make those connections? How do they deploy long-term thinking and so on? And then also duties to monitor and assess the progress that they were making. And I often describe the role really, and in law it's set out as the Future Generations Commissioner is, you can see there in section 18A2, that to be the guardian of the ability of future generations to meet their needs. But often the role was really about calling out the madness of short-term policy making, connecting government departments. I spent an inordinate amount of time introducing civil servants in one department to civil servants in another department, saying, the 20,000 affordable homes that the government have committed to, well, and over here in the skills department, you're developing a skills plan. Well, maybe you need to be, making sure your skills plan has the people in it who are going to build the 20,000 affordable homes. And maybe we actually need to join up with the department who deal with inequality to make sure that the people going into those jobs are not people who are already better off in society, but maybe they're women, maybe they're Black, Asian, minority ethnic people, those people who are furthest from the labour market. So that join up and taking that helicopter view from across government was critically important. And it's something which is absent in so many of our systems of governance. Here's just a slide in terms of the infrastructure or the architecture of the Future Generations Act. So the 7 wellbeing goals, those goals supported by national indicators, so 50 national indicators, which are tracking the progress as a nation across those goals, the setting of milestones by government, what is it that we are aiming to achieve in terms of those indicators by when, and then the production of a future trends report. Then individual duties on each of the 50 bodies covered by the Act, collective duties through the establishment of something called public services boards, where all of the key public services in each local authority area must come together to set a collective wellbeing plan, the things that they can do and the things that they can only achieve collectively, and some similar duties on the lower level of local government infrastructure, community councils. I've talked about the 5 ways of working, and then, of course, enabling the change and providing accountability for the change. My role as the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and also a role for the Auditor General for Wales, particularly to examine how those public institutions were applying the 5 ways of working. In reality, that meant myself and the Auditor General for Wales working very closely together, doing joint audits, sharing intelligence, and so on, and reaching common conclusions. Hang on, I'm not sure why I am not moving now. There we go. This is a model which I think, oh, hang on, I've gone too far now. A model which I have found useful in the public sector in Wales. Have found useful to understand what it is that we're trying to achieve here. This is called the 3 Horizons model. If we look at Horizon 1, this is sort of business as usual. What will happen if we carry on with business as usual? What will happen if we carry on with, with the way in which we consume beyond planetary boundaries? What will happen if we carry on in terms of the trajectory, in terms of mental health, or in terms of wealth inequality? We're going to be on a downward trend, and we are on a downward trend in many cases. Horizon 3 then, the green line, really this is where we're trying to get to. This is, the vision of where we want to be. And Horizon 2 is what are the things, therefore, that we need to do? What are the innovations, the new policy decisions, the new approaches that we need to take in order to get us towards this new normal? Now, here's the kind of trick, I suppose, in terms of our approach in Wales. First of all, we know where it is we're trying to go. And that's not something that every country can say. You might have a plethora of policy documents and strategies and so on, and you might have the short-term programme for government for whatever political party is in government at that particular time, but you don't necessarily have a long-term vision. We do have that long-term vision in Wales, so we know where we're trying to go. And we also know that that long-term vision is a joined up and connected one. So if I just sort of play out here why that's so important. If we took the example of decarbonising our transportation system, so we know in order to meet our carbon emissions targets, in order to meet our, the agreements that we've made in terms of the COP and the Paris Climate Accord and so on, that transport is a key area where we need to reduce our emissions. If that's our sole aim, then, for example, a Horizon 2 intervention or innovation could be mass investment in electric vehicles. Macron has done something similar in France, grants for electric vehicles, rolling out more electric vehicle infrastructure. And of course, we will need some of that. However, if your aim is not just to decarbonise a transportation system, but is also to reduce inequality and to improve the cohesion of communities and make communities more connected, and to address health issues, then actually investing in electric vehicles is that Horizon 2 negative. It's taking us back to business as usual. We're all still sat in our EVs getting fatter because we're not walking or cycling anywhere. We're still not talking to our neighbours because we're in our cars. We're still sat in congestion in our EVs rather than our petrol or diesel vehicles, and our towns and cities are still clogged up by cars. And those people who are living in poverty, who can't afford diesel or petrol cars, definitely can't afford electric vehicles. So what we see there is that some of the innovations in play, if they're not tested against a holistic framework and long-term wellbeing framework, actually they can just reinforce business as usual. and they can actually work against the long-term holistic well-being for our citizens. So a much better investment, if we're applying a long-term holistic lens, is actually investment in public transport and active travel interventions. And that is exactly what we are doing in Wales by applying that framework. The first big test of the legislation was government proposals to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity building a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with the problem here. This is the M4 around Newport, an area which is heavily congested. And of course, you know, you get a problem with congestion. It's a live issue here in Auckland, and I'm sure in cities, well, I know in cities across the world that, you know, we've got a problem with congestion. What do? We build another road. If any of you have ever been to Texas, and I'm sure other parts of the US as well, I was in Texas a couple of years ago on an 8-lane freeway, which started as 3 lanes, and then they added another lane and another lane and another lane and another lane. And essentially, when we keep building roads, we fill them. When we keep building roads rather than investing in modal shift, there's no other opportunities for people to do anything differently. So I intervened in this issue, and I asked the government to explain to me how they'd applied the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to the proposal to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity building this road. I asked them to explain to me, let's just go back to these goals, how it was in line with the goal of a prosperous Wales, and how it was in line with meeting our carbon and climate targets, how it was in line with the goal of a resilient Wales, which is about maintaining and enhancing a biodiverse natural environment, because that road was going through a nature reserve. I asked them how it was in line with the goal of a healthier Wales when we have illegal levels of air pollution with a direct correlation to poor health and indeed death, and how it was in line with the fact that we have 58% of our adult population, 26% of our kids who are overweight or obese. So what's the long-term health consequences there? And then finally, how is it in line with the goal of a more equal Wales? Because 25% of the lowest income households in that area don't even own a car. So we'd be spending the entire of the government's borrowing capacity on something which benefits the already better off. So you can see by applying that holistic lens in terms of a transport scenario, that actually building a road is not sensible at all. And so the government, it was widely regarded to be a done deal that this road was going to be built. Of course, you can imagine the economy versus environment arguments that were playing out here. But actually, when you apply a holistic wellbeing lens to that, the government found it, well, they were unable to justify how they'd applied the Future Generations Act and this new way of thinking that our law requires to this decision. So the First Minister changed his mind, cancelled the road, and we went even further. We looked at our whole transport strategy for Wales to say it needs to be made fit for application of the Future Generations Act. So the new transport strategy for Wales puts investment which supports private motor vehicles right at the bottom of the transport hierarchy, and walking and cycling, because that's best for our well-being across all of those domains, at the top in terms of investment. Our government was spending 2/3 of their infrastructure investment budget on building roads, and I challenged them on how, on the one hand, have you declared climate emergency and need to be applying these holistic well-being goals, and where is your justification for spending the entire of your infrastructure investment budget, or sorry, 2/3 of your infrastructure investment budget on building roads? So within 2 years following those challenges, that started to decrease. It's down to 1/3, with the difference going into investment in public transport and active travel. And in 2022, following my interventions in terms of the whole road building programme for Wales, asking for justification on each of the 55 pre-approved road building schemes that existed in Wales, 51 of those 55 road building schemes were cancelled because they cannot be justified when you apply a holistic well-being lens. So we've fundamentally transformed our approach to transport strategy in Wales. That's probably the best example of a whole system sort of reform in a particular policy area. And just an example here of how that's playing out locally. So in Cardiff, our capital city, actually a public health consultant was seconded into the council to lead on the development of the transportation strategy. And that's really interesting because when you apply a public health lens to a transport problem, you generally don't get the building of new roads. You get some really interesting changes. So what he looked at is where are the areas with the highest levels of air pollution, the areas with the lowest levels of life expectancy, correlations there in terms of inequity as well. Large numbers of our Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities living in those inner city suburbs with these high levels of air pollution. So let's target our public transport and active travel investment to those areas. In doing that, let's clean and green those areas. So our new walking and cycling routes are constructed using nature, which also contributes to the goal of a resilient Wales. And actually, doctors in Cardiff, as part of this programme, can actually issue prescriptions for free bike hire, because you might be going to a doctor with high cholesterol or on the edge of diabetes. You might, benefit from physical activity. And so by doctors prescribing bikes instead of statins, you might be solving multiple issues in the long term. You might be improving health, reducing air pollution, making that community more connected, and so on. And we can see here another example of the healthcare system responding to the requirement to look holistically at everything that they do. So this is the first hospital-based solar farm in the UK, which has exceeded its expectations in terms of powering the hospital facilities, reducing, of course, their carbon emissions, actually making cost savings, which they're enabling them to put that back into frontline investment in the healthcare system. When reducing waste also tackles loneliness. So Wales has a long history of, really promising work on waste reduction. So we're the third best country in the world for our rates of recycling. But actually our new framework around wellbeing says we can't just take a linear approach to reducing waste. How can we reduce waste whilst also meeting as many of those wellbeing goals as possible? So here, the strategy from government, which is now being rolled out across the country, are things like setting up the library of things. So they call the Welsh word for that, which is borrow benthyg, where you can go and you can borrow all of the things that we tend to keep in our garages or our attics and might use once a year: your paint strippers, your hedge trimmers, your lawn mowers, tents if you want to go camping, and a whole range of different things, all of which have taken resources, planetary resources, for us to produce and leave in our garage for the majority of the time. They have a financial cost, of course, which isn't available to many people, particularly those living in poverty. And then they have a waste cost when they break and they go into landfill and so on. So why don't we bring together communities to actually share that? We can reduce waste and we can share and we can connect communities. And on the right here, you can see our repair cafes. So instead of sending your phone or your microwave or your television or whatever it might be to landfill when it's broken, volunteers are helping to repair those things. You can go along, you can have your whatever repaired, you can have a chat. The volunteers, volunteering is good for health as well. So we're looking at all of those connections. How can we do the things that we need to do in a way which maximizes the benefit? The final example that I want to share with you, and there are many more if we had more time, is our education system. So across the world, our education systems are, in very many cases, are still educating for an industrial age. We're still imparting knowledge on our, to our children and our young people, rather than the skills that they will need to thrive in later life. We know that the world of work is changing. We know that there are really worrying trends around poor mental health amongst young people, which continue into adulthood. So most enduring mental health conditions start before the age of 14. So it must be the role of our education system, not just to impart knowledge with our young people at the moment, but actually to equip them for a life well lived, a life through the lens, from our perspective, of our 7 wellbeing goals. So these are the 4 purposes of our curriculum in Wales: to develop healthy and confident individuals, ambitious and capable learners, enterprising and creative contributors. We know creativity, one of those things that robots can't do. It's going to be one of the key skills that humans, will need in the future. And then ethical and informed citizens, recognising that we want our young people in Wales not just to come out of the education system understanding their place as global consumers, but actually as global citizens as well. So imagine if everyone in the world had been through an education system which equipped us to be ethical and informed citizens. Would we have the wealth inequality gaps that we have now, the climate crisis that we have now, and so on? So those are just some of the examples of things that have changed, but also none of this is easy. And I started with my little girl and a sort of aspiration of how I want future generations to grow up. And now I'm going to end with a pretty grim view of my back garden. This is my lawn, which is an absolutely beleaguered lawn. I've got 5 children, 4 boys who play a lot of football on this, and there's a man cave at the end of it which teenagers regularly tramp down to, and my grass is looking pretty sad. And I think this for me kind of reflects a lot of the system that I've dealt with over 25-year career in public services. So we see shoots of, we see green shoots in parts of the system, and certainly the Future Generations Act in Wales is enabling those, more and more of those green shoots to come through. But the system really is quite kind of rotten at its core. The system still perpetuates short-term thinking across the world. It still, focuses on, addressing the here and now. It's very difficult for innovation and different ways of doing things to break through this pretty hard soil. What the Future Generations Act has done for us in Wales is those people in the system who I describe as frustrated champions. These are the people, let's take them as the blades of grass, who've managed to push through. They tell me that the Future Generations Act, because it is a law, it enables them to challenge the system and challenge the status quo and shake a piece of law at the naysayers, to say that we must act in the long term and we must do things differently, and we can't just carry on doing the same thing and expecting new results. I believe that the system is starting to change in Wales. We still have a long way to go, but I believe that the system in the rest of the world requires a lot of nutrition in that grass. It requires a lot of change, and it requires fundamental reform if we're going to get beyond just doing the right things in terms of particular initiatives to doing the right things across the board, so that our future generations can thrive.